It's been 2 months since the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, and there are clear indications that countries want the UN negotiations to make further progress.
This is Yvo de Boer, who oversaw global climate talks for 4 years as Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, from August of 2006 to July 2010.
Without question, a global agreement offers the most effective response to climate change.
This recording is from February 2010, right after countries had agreed on the Copenhagen Climate Accord, which most news organizations had largely dismissed or ignored, in part because it hadn't yielded the kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all target that you can summarize in a headline and explain in a tweet. But if you were paying attention back then, you saw that something was bubbling up from below.
By the middle of February, 70 industrialized and developing countries had sent the Secretariat information regarding their national goals and their national plans of action.
Over the ensuing 5 years, individual countries would continue to step up with climate action plans. And the UNFCCC, under de Boer's successor, Christiana Figueres, continued to establish global agreement on how to measure and account for greenhouse gas emissions from industry, from farming, and from transportation. In 2013, negotiators in Warsaw agreed to abandon the quixotic quest for a top-down, one-size-fits-all emission reduction target and opted instead to work towards the creation of a science-based global goal while letting individual countries find their own way of contributing to that goal. This eventually led to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, which provides a framework within which countries can compete to reduce emissions at a pace that suits each country's unique circumstance. In November of last year, just ahead of the Katowice climate talks in Poland, Yvo de Boer became president of the Gold Standard, which is an NGO-led global partnership that sets standards for everything from projects that generate carbon offsets by, say, saving forests, to the way we recognize contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which are a set of 17 goals that all the countries of the world endorsed in 2015 to promote sustainable development that lifts people from poverty while preserving nature. They're woven into the Paris Agreement and into the lending guidelines of development banks around the world. But how do you measure something like gender equality, which is one of the SDGs? And what has Yvo de Boer been doing since he left the UNFCCC?
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields, and not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And it's a question that today's guest has grappled with his entire career, from his early days as a social worker to a stint with the UNFCCC, to his later career in sustainable finance, and today with the Gold Standard, among other things. I ran into him last month at year-end climate talks in Katowice, Poland, but we conducted this interview by phone the week after the talks. We'd planned on discussing the outcome of the talks themselves and the role of carbon markets in helping countries reduce their emissions deeper, because that issue was pushed back to next year. We do get to that at the very end of today's show, and I'm working on both Ecosystem Marketplace articles and Bionic Planet episodes that I hope will flesh that issue out. But we spent the bulk of today's show talking about de Boer's own life and how his experiences inform the work he's doing now. We also talked about explosive chickens, watermelon heads, and Dutch criminals, but you'll have to stick around to find out what that's all about. I spoke to Yvo very rarely when he was running the UNFCCC, even though he was always accessible and always willing to answer questions. That's because I was focused narrowly on forestry and finance, so I tended to spend my time with the science guys. For me, it was great to finally chat with this guy who's been so central to these proceedings and such a gentleman in dealing with us all. A quick warning, the sound quality is a bit iffy. Yvo was on the phone and I was using a new set of headphones, so we both sound alternately crackly and robotic. But the content itself is, I think, fascinating, and I hope you do too.
First, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me. The last time we spoke was at the 2016 climate talks in Marrakesh, and it was the day after Donald Trump had been elected president of the United States. You were pretty optimistic then, and I'm wondering if you're still optimistic with the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil and the general backsliding in global cooperation that we're seeing, the populist uprising in France after President Macron tried to implement a carbon tax. Where do you think we are? Is the glass half full, half empty, or is it shattered on the floor?
My sense is that the glass is more than half full because of the growing global understanding of climate change as an issue and the desire to see it be addressed. There will always be skeptics, but by and large, people accept the science. They find the science to be credible. They see that a lot of the things that in the past relied on scenarios and assumptions, people see that reality is now beginning to bear out the accuracy of the scenarios, so that's good. Where the glass becomes a little bit more half empty or significantly more half empty is when it comes to the willingness to make difficult decisions that go along with taking the science seriously and acting on climate change, especially when some of those difficult decisions affect people personally, especially in the financial sphere. And what we're seeing is the politics in some places sitting in the middle of that, in the sense of either politicians who say, well, we're not entirely convinced and we certainly don't think we should be making expensive choices that will hurt people's jobs. Trump is in that camp, maybe Bolsonaro to some extent as well. And then a number of politicians who are afraid of making difficult political choices associated with action on climate change, which might have a backlash, of which the French President Macron is an example. He tried to introduce environmental taxation. Incidentally, he wasn't spending much of the revenue or planning to spend much of the revenue on the environment, but he introduced environmental legislation and then got a backlash on that. A little while ago, I was actually talking to a former president of Indonesia, Yudhoyono, who told me that he had 3 times tried to increase gasoline prices and had riots out on the street and had to withdraw those measures. Incidentally, in both instances, in the case of Macron and in the case of Indonesia, although environmental regulation was the trigger, I don't think it's actually an aversion to environmental action that was the root cause. It was simply an environmental tax that got along, that got people angry. They protested to that, and they protested against the level of taxation rather than against a measure to address climate change. Understanding of the science is growing, but we're still struggling to accept the economic and financial consequences of recognizing the issue that is becoming ever more evident. Sorry for that very long and complicated.
No, that was great. It was a good arc, and it sets up the issues that I wanted to get into here, which is how to do policy right, and also how to sell it. I mean, you mentioned Indonesia, and they have, as I understand it, a gasoline subsidy right now. So if you're trying to go from a subsidy to a tax, I can see how that would be kind of a shock to the system. And at the same time, isn't that what leadership is all about? Selling rather than pandering. I mean, staying with Indonesia, I had a conversation with Benny Hernedi. He's a Bupati, a district leader, and he said that he was having a hard time campaigning on climate and sustainable forestry until they had these wildfires a few years back. And then all of a sudden, air pollution was everywhere. It was a tangible health issue. And they were able to get people to more sustainably manage their palm oil and other cash crops because forests were being burned to make way for these crops. And at the same time, they linked it to climate change. But that connection didn't just happen. They sold it. They actively went out and connected it for people. And we're seeing the same thing in the United States. When you talk about climate change, people's eyes used to kind of glaze over. But then we saw California burning. A lot of farmers saw their harvests coming in late. I talked to a guy in Katowice who's still harvesting his soybeans, I think, which is very late. People became receptive. But it's up to leaders to use that receptivity. Leadership is about selling people on something rather than just going with what people want, right?
Sure, but I mean, if you look at the example of fuel subsidies which you mentioned, generally those fuel subsidies benefit middle-income people and richer people to a significantly greater degree than the poor, if only because the poor ride around on bicycles rather than in automobiles. And you see in a number of countries where, for example, electricity is subsidized, that it's the middle-income families with 8 air conditioners that benefit more than the person sitting outside their hut with maybe an electric fan at best. And those middle-income and richer people tend to have the ear of the politicians and are much more vocal in terms of protesting. So often it's the poor who would stand to benefit most from environmental regulation, but benefit least from subsidies, whereas the middle income and the richer people who benefit most from the subsidies are significantly more vocal and listened to by the politicians. I suppose to your earlier point about politicians and leadership, actually the only thing that you really need in order to be a successful leader is followers. The problem is if you do things that your followers don't like, then you're likely to lose them and your leadership position. So that's sort of the continual struggle, I think, for politicians that are willing to do brave things that they know they are going to be unpopular for. There's generally, I think, a reluctance today on the part of politicians to be brave in favor of what they know to be right. And the closer elections come, the greater is their lack of willingness to show bravery. Because if they are brave and if they do the right thing, there's a good chance that they will lose the next election and the benefits will be reaped by the person who comes after those elections. And one of the things that really strikes me today is that we're pretty short on politicians that are willing to show real leadership and take us in a sensible direction. And I think we've either lost the number of people that are willing to do that or are on the brink of doing so. For example, the German Chancellor Merkel, who I think was willing to be brave on a number of matters of principle, and has now seen that basically cost her position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And although at the same time we are seeing young people stepping up, the most recent elections in the United States give me a lot of optimism. The talk of a a new Green Deal and pushing forward with climate legislation seems to be resonating with the younger crowd. It's us geezers who are asleep at the switch on this one.
Well, yes, there's enthusiasm on the part of young people, but I think there's also still in the United States a pretty significant division between people that live in the enlightened urban belt and the people that live in the less advanced countryside. I mean, you mentioned a new Green Deal. I mean, I'm not an American, but I think in the United States a lot of this is also associated with a political inclination. I mean, I remember being not all that long ago on an American television show where somebody called in and said I was a watermelon, which basically means that you're green on the outside and red, i.e. a communist on the inside, and it almost seems to imply that if you like the environment, you must be a communist as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. A lot of the libertarian push that we saw in the last few decades, basically trying to vilify anything that requires government intervention. We'll see what happens on that. Before we go into your background, I wanted to just briefly let people know what you're doing now, because you've shifted from the UNFCCC, then you were consulting, and now you're working with the Gold Standard. And as I understand it, you're going to be helping them find ways of aligning the Sustainable Development Goals with quantifiable outcomes. Is that right, or what exactly is the mission there? How does that all fit together?
Yeah, that's part of it. I suppose there was a period in my life where I was very much focused on making things almost more complicated. So my work in the climate change negotiations was about a very complicated political process, which I still believe is very important. But I also believe the simple things in life are important, and I also believe that examples of success are important, that those encourage people, give them hope that in this very complicated world that there are real solutions. So everything that I'm doing, and the Gold Standard is part of that, I'll end with it rather than begin with it, but everything that I'm doing at the moment is associated with keeping it simple and showing results. I do three things at the moment. One is I'm involved in a European organization which is all about giving innovators startup capital to bring great climate ideas into the market. So that's all about giving people 50,000 euro grants or $200,000 grants to basically take a climate innovation idea to the point where potentially it can be taken up by more conventional investors. There's a thing called the Valley of Death that basically is the separation point between the bright idea on the left hand of the Valley of Death and an investor being willing to take it forward on the right side of the Valley of Death. And how do you get through that Valley of Death of developing the initial idea? So that what this institution does is, using European money, every year give about 80 million euros in startup capital to investors, which I think is great and I think is very practical.
Yeah. Do you guys fund podcasts?
Sorry?
Do you fund podcasts?
Well, if it's a zero energy, then maybe.
I was only half joking there. I started Bionic Planet to help meet the climate challenge by sharing what I've learned over the past decade with people outside the climate echo chamber. And I'm not being melodramatic at the opening of each show when I say that nothing is as it was. We are living in a new reality, and I want to give you the tools you need to navigate it. I left mainstream media over a decade ago because, quite frankly, they weren't putting resources into covering climate change. And now that they've finally woken up to the enormity of the challenge, they're still failing to understand, let alone explain, the emerging solutions. If these are issues you want to learn more about, then help me help you by giving me a 5-star review on Radio Public, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access me. That's important because the more reviews I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to get out of this mess. We can do it if we work together. Today's show is a byproduct of an article that I'm writing for Ecosystem Marketplace, so you can thank my employer, Forest Trends, for its existence. The most successful shows I've produced, however, are those I create explicitly for the podcast audience. It's a whole different way of producing something, and to do those really well, I need to allot more of my time and to hire a sound designer and a producer, even if on a freelance basis. Just listen to the credits at the end of your favorite big-budget mainstream podcasts. It's always more than one guy on a PC working in his spare time. If you find value in what I'm delivering, you can get more Bionic Planet by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com. You can support me for as little as $1 per episode, either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Finally, you can help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher, namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for everyone who listens to the show to the end, and that adds up. Now we pick up where we left off with Yvo de Boer describing the projects that he's working on today.
Then the second thing I do is that I have the feeling that there's an awful lot of really exciting things happening in the world. The climate outcome in Poland a couple of weeks ago, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals is all great stuff, but also some not so great stuff, like more and more development money being used to keep refugees out of the countries that they want to get into, or in camps in the countries that they want to get into, rather than in society. And my sense is that a lot of development agencies, a lot of organizations working on sustainability, on climate, are not really thinking about, well, what does all of that mean for me and for my relevance? So the second piece I do is working with development agencies. So I've been working with the Global Water Partnership, with a number of agricultural research institutions, with a number of finance institutions to basically stop and think, to say, okay, well, what has changed out there that should be relevant to me as an organization? Is what I'm doing still relevant in the light of that change, or should I be doing things differently? And finally, do I have the people, the products and services that can actually allow me to do what's relevant instead of doing what's maybe a little bit more irrelevant? And the third thing I do is the gold standard, which I got into relatively recently, a couple of months ago.
Let me cut away for a second to give you more details on the gold standard and the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, starting with the latter. I did a whole episode on the SDGs at the very beginning of Bionic Planet, episode 5, which remains one of my most popular episodes, with close to 30,000 downloads. You can still find it online by Googling Radio Public Bionic Planet and scrolling down to episode 5. But I'll probably spruce it up a bit and rerun it as an encore episode soon. In a nutshell, the SDGs are 17 sustainability goals that every country in the world signed off on in 2015. They've since been woven into the lending guidelines of development banks around the world, and socially minded investors like pension funds are beginning to pay attention as well. The SDGs provide a standardized way for investors, and especially pension funds, to measure the sustainability of companies they invest in. And more than half of the 100 largest companies in the world have pledged to support the SDGs. But how do you make sure it's not just a bunch of blah-de-blah? To begin with, the 17 goals are broken down into 169 specific targets. And these targets are further broken down into more than 300 so-called indicators of success. Some of these indicators are pretty concrete and easy to verify. For example, Goal 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for people of all ages. Some of the targets they've created under that aim to reduce specific diseases, and the indicator for each disease is the number of new infections per 1,000 people. Other indicators are fuzzier and look at things like teacher qualifications, which vary from country to country and even district to district. So how do you turn these indicators into verifiable units of measure? Well, that's where the gold standard comes in. Like the verified carbon standard, which we've covered before, the gold standard has spent years creating science-based ways of quantifying the greenhouse gas impacts of programs that save forests and develop wind farms, among other things. In these cases, the amount of greenhouse gas was the easy part. The hard part has been quantifying the impact of human action on those gases. And now these same standard-setting bodies are creating sustainable development standards built around the 300-plus SDG indicators. If you're a bit lost, don't worry. I'll cover this all in more and hopefully simpler detail in another episode. And we'll loop back to the SDGs in a bit today, too. But first, I asked Yvo for more detail on the funding initiative that he mentioned earlier.
The funding initiative that you're working with, what's it called? I don't know if you mentioned that.
It's an organization called Climate Kick. So that it's well, let me describe this rather irreverently. It's built on the California model that you take 2 handfuls of money, you throw it in the air, and some of it will land on stony ground and some of it will land on fertile ground. And that model of really investing in innovation worked well in California, worked well in the U.S. So the European Commission a number of years ago decided in a number of areas that they were going to invest in innovation. So they did that the European Commission did that in a number of areas which they felt were key to the future modernization of Europe. So on healthcare, on ICT, on transport, on energy, and happily on climate change. So this organization every year gets 80 million euros from the European Commission to pass that money on to innovators, to people with bright ideas.
I know you don't invest in podcasts, but what are some of the things you do invest in? Can you describe one?
What I think is a fantastic project called Second Skin. And the idea of the Second Skin project is that it's really, really difficult and expensive to insulate a building from the inside, an existing building. But what about if you put a second skin around it? What about if you put a layer of insulation around the outside and make it look attractive? That's just as effective, a lot cheaper, a lot faster, less complicated, etc. So that kind of stuff.
Just simple solutions that everyone says, Jesus, why didn't I think of that?
Yeah.
Maybe we can come back to the gold standard now. I find it intellectually fascinating that you guys are trying to measure these fuzzy things like women's empowerment. I'm actually working on a story about that one. But what is it that drew you to gold standard?
It strikes a balance in interests. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you have a bunch of people who believe, yes, climate action needs to be taken, but they'd like to take it as cheaply and as cost-effectively as possible. And they think that emission credits, buying emission reductions from the people that can achieve them most cheaply, is a good way of helping the environment and your wallet at the same time. And on the other hand, you have a bunch of people who feel that action on climate change shouldn't only be about reducing emissions, but about investing in sustainable development and taking societies and economic growth in a different direction. And what the gold standard does is basically focus on both of those to, first of all, ensure through certification that if somebody claims to have reduced a ton of emissions, that they really have, that it's a real reduction, that it brings a real climate benefit. And secondly, through more recent work which focuses on measuring what people are really doing to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, also giving a quality tag on that, also certifying on that. So what the gold standard is basically doing is giving investors and the communities who benefit from action the confidence that what is being done means a real contribution to reducing emissions and a real contribution to sustainable development. So those three things that I do at the moment, apart from working in my garden, are all about trying to do real small-scale, credible stuff that leads to real change.
I think it'd be interesting to kind of go back and trace your own development and how you got here. You were born in Vienna, you studied social work, and then you ended up in finance. You've got a really interesting history here. Can you talk a little bit about how you got into this particular field? What what your milestones were in your life?
Yeah. After I'd done my compulsory military service, I did a degree in social work with a specialization in prisoner rehabilitation, or probation as it's called in some part of the world, or parole, I think it's called in the U.S. At the end of that course, there was an internship which I did in the Dutch city of Leiden. Now, Leiden has the oldest university in the Netherlands, so there's a lot of extremely intelligent people walking around in Leiden. But Leiden also has an extremely high level of criminality, which is associated with the fact that there's an awful bunch of very low-income people in Leiden as well, mainly the people that put down the cobbled streets that Holland is so famous for. And my client base, the people I was working with, were mainly young delinquents. And 97% of those young people were back behind bars within a year. So I thought, do I really want to spend 40 years of my life working on a 7% success rate, or 6% if it's 94 behind bars, then 6% success rate, which didn't seem very appealing. Plus I had the feeling that from that job I wasn't able to help the people with what they needed most, which was jobs and income and a different environment. So I never went into that profession, and then, when you've got a degree in social work with a specialization in prisoner rehabilitation, it's not a very relevant CV to do other things with. But I happen to speak 5 languages, so I managed to get a job in the international department of a housing ministry. And then a couple of years later, I'd sort of been working on housing for a number of years, which is extremely practical, and I wanted to do something completely different. And then I saw a job to become head of the climate change department in the environment ministry, and I thought, well, what can be more different from housing than climate change? So I made the switch, and then got hooked, and I've sort of been a climate junkie ever since, because I think the thing that fascinates me most about climate, maybe next to the severity of the problem or the magnitude of the challenge, is the incredible complexity of the solution. Because though climate is an environmental issue, in its solution it's fundamentally an economic challenge, and it really reaches into every aspect of our social fabric, energy, transport, agriculture, you name it. It cuts right across society. So that's fascinating in its complexity. But secondly, the fact that interests are so hugely different. Both you and I were in Poland a little while ago at the climate change conference, where an awful lot of people earn an income out of coal mining, and they'd like to continue doing that. You've got countries like Saudi Arabia, which get 97% of their national income from oil and gas. But there are also small island developing states which could disappear as a result of sea level rise. So it's complicated, and that makes it fascinating.
Okay. And your most high-profile position was as Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, which you took over in 2006. What were the biggest challenges you faced, the biggest surprises, things that you did not expect to encounter?
The first thing that struck me was that at that time, climate as an issue was completely under the radar of heads of government and CEOs. It was very much seen at that time as a sort of niche environmental issue like biodiversity or desertification or soil conservation that serious, hard-nosed people didn't need to worry about. It was sort of in the domain of the greenies. You know, having worked for an environment ministry myself, I know that environment ministries are generally the weakest ministry in an administration with little or no influence, and they lose every single battle to the bigger economic players. So my sense was if I don't manage to get this issue onto the radar screens of heads of state and government and CEOs who can sort of look across issues, then it's never going to be solved. Mm-hmm. So that's why in the run-up to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, I focused very much on the media and focused on getting heads of states and government involved. And that worked because it used to be not a single self-respecting government leader would come to a climate conference. And in Copenhagen there were over 80, not all the right ones. I remember bumping into Mr. Gaddafi there and Ahmadinejad and Mugabe, but there was also Obama and Merkel, and I think getting it to that level has helped, at least I hoped it's helped. And the second thing that struck me was the complete lack of understanding of the economics of climate change when I got into this topic. So there was a great deal of focus on the negative environmental impacts, but there was almost no focus on getting the economics of climate action right. And if you bear in mind that 80% of at least CO2 emissions are energy-related CO2 emissions, which are significantly industry activity related, and if you bear in mind that in well-functioning countries, 80% of investments in the energy sector are private rather than public, it becomes pretty evident that you need to understand the economics of climate action. So the thing I did quite early in my tenure was to produce a number of reports, analyses of major financial flows around energy and climate to understand which buttons we needed to be pushing if we wanted to take investments in a different direction. The third thing that struck me is that if we had to sacrifice the English language and we're only allowed to keep one word, the word that I would want to keep is the word why. And the reason for that is that I see people in negotiations, or generally in life, taking positions, but very seldom being asked why they're taking that position, and seldom being asked what interest actually underlies that position. And I very firmly believe that unless you ask the why question, unless you really understand what's motivating a certain position, you can never come to a solution. So the third thing I did was put more emphasis on conversation, on asking questions, on understanding the why, so that you can come to solutions that address an underlying concern rather than a stated and probably ill-understood position.
Would you be able to maybe unpack that just a bit and talk about a specific sticking point that asking why was able to move beyond?
Well, probably somebody from an oil-producing country in the negotiations is going to tell you that they don't want the price of fossil fuel energy to be increased. And the superficial motivation for that is that they are afraid that if you increase the price of fossil fuel energy, it's going to hurt their economy. But what you really, I think, need to understand is that the underlying fear is loss of economic opportunity and loss of jobs. And once you understand that, you can then begin to have a conversation about the kind of economic diversification that would allow a country to create jobs in new areas and therefore worry less about the increase in cost of fossil fuels. If you look at the debate at the moment in Poland, where we've just come from, there is a lot of opposition to climate action, but that opposition doesn't have its roots in disbelief in the issue, but in the fear of economic disadvantage.
Right. So, and it's not coal specifically as it is. How do we get taken care of if this disappears?
Yeah. You see a number of oil companies at the moment, some quite sincerely, some less sincerely, making the transition from being an oil company to being an energy solutions provider. You see, certainly here in Europe, utilities whose core business used to be to sell electricity and sell as much of it as they could. Their business model today is to sell as little energy as possible, because they've become energy services companies. They don't make their money selling more and more electricity. They make their money advising people on how they can use less and less electricity through innovation.
And I guess that's why when you left the UNFCCC after Copenhagen in 2010, you started working with the private sector. I know you were KPMG for a while, but I was never really sure what you were doing. I'd see you at events, and you were always talking about the need to get private sector engagement. Can you fill us in on that? What were you doing after leaving the UNFCCC, and how did that bring you to where you are now?
What I've really tried to do is to understand this challenge from multiple perspectives. So I started off with working for government, and from the perspective of a government of a country with a particular economy, trying to understand the challenge from that perspective. Then moved into the UN role, trying to manage the intergovernmental negotiations, so trying to understand the issue from the perspective of the United Nations, which is supposed to represent all of the constituencies. And then I actually spent 4 years working with a big global audit and consulting firm, one of the big four, which was exclusively working with the private sector on helping them to try and understand how they could make sustainability part of the core of their business strategy. So not something that you do for environmental health and safety or from corporate social responsibility, but really trying to integrate it into the core of the value proposition of a company. And then I spent a number of years working for an organization that was actually trying to help 28 countries to green their macroeconomic policy around energy, green cities, land use, and water. And now the gold standard, which sort of cuts across everything. So basically what I've tried to do is to understand this perspective, this issue from the perspective of all of the major constituencies involved in trying to crack this one.
I'm trying to crack something too, and that's how to make Bionic Planet into something more than just a tax write-off. I have a friend named Rhett Butler. That's his real name, by the way, and for fans of old movies, it's because his grandfather bunked with Clark Gable back in the Army. Anyway, Rhett runs an excellent publication called Manga Bay, and he and I were commiserating about journalism a while back. And he said something along the lines of how you can spend 2 months on an investigative piece that uncovers something world-changing, but it gets just a few thousand readers, while you then post a picture of little monkey stuck in the mud and you get 2 million shares. This is a big challenge in journalism today. He and I are both covering stuff that's very, very important, but not inherently entertaining. I realize that every episode of Bionic Planet has the potential to be a lot more fun to listen to than it is. And if I had the time to edit with a team of people or prep better, it probably would be. You can help me generate more of these episodes and make them better, more fun to listen to by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com, where you can support me for as little as $1 per episode, either via bionic-planet.com or via patreon.com/bionicplanet. You can also help just by listening through the right podcatcher, namely listen to me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio but backwards. They automatically pay me a few cents for every listener who hears the show to the end, and that adds up. Finally, if nothing else, give me a good 5-star review on whichever podcaster you use, because the more stars I get, the more ears I get, and the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach.
I work so much on the land use side, and we've been doing a lot of work on green supply chains in the last couple of years, and I was at the TFA 2020 meeting in Accra. One thing that really struck me there was how in years past you had a lot of companies that were maybe doing the right thing, making the adjustment, shifting to sustainably produced palm oil, for example, although I guess often they were doing it on plantations where they'd already done their deforesting, so there's a little bit of fudging there. But you did have some companies that seemed to be legitimately trying to purge deforestation from their supply chains, but we had this issue of leakage where maybe this little cluster of companies is improving things, and they're exporting to Europe and to a lesser extent the U.S., whereas countries that do the wrong thing are just exporting to China and India. And the interesting thing that seemed to be emerging in Accra was the companies that did the right thing are now calling for tougher regulations. It's almost like this sense that, and it kind of goes back to this issue of tools. You know, some people, when they look at market-based mechanisms or financial incentives, they seem to fixate on the limitations of these tools, not realizing that they're one part of a whole toolbox. We need to think of the proper incentives, but then we also need to have proper regulation. Do you have any just thoughts on how to walk this balance? How do you implement a system where you've got the right carrots and the right sticks, and where you've got enough of these powerful forces advocating for the use of sticks as well as carrots?
Well, generally, I'd say that that carrots work better than sticks. And there's a great example from the area that you were talking about just now. A number of years ago, I did some work with some really big international consumer goods companies who used to be extremely focused on supply chain management. So they were focused on forcing standards into their supply chain. So making sure that people in their supply chain were behaving properly and doing the right thing, which if you take a company like Walmart, which has got 200,000 suppliers around the world, forcing a certain kind of behavior in your supply chain has a lot of impact, but it's also quite difficult to actually manage and to guarantee. And then a number of years ago we had this turning point. It's partly due actually to climate, where the focus was less and less on supply chain management and more on security of supply, where companies began to recognize that actually things like cocoa, but other commodities are becoming increasingly difficult to produce for reasons including climate change. And it's actually really important for a company to secure supply. If you're a grain grower somewhere, you know, you can sell that grain to a bakery, to a brewery, to you name it. So what these major consumer goods companies started to do was to work on security of supply by improving the livelihoods of the people that were in their supply chain. So by helping farmers to do better farming, to get access to better equipment, to understand markets better, weather conditions better, disease better, etc. And that positive action to improve the incomes and livelihoods of people in their supply chain actually had a much more positive impact than trying to force a whole bunch of supply chain management rules into the system. So in that sense, I think people that are focusing on the carrots rather than on the sticks have an advantage. At the same time, there's of course the risk that people will not behave in the way that they should. I remember years ago visiting a pulp and paper company in Taiwan, and they had one pile of certified logs which were going to go into paper for European and North American markets, so certified wood, certified paper. They had another pile of uncertified logs, which were basically intended for the Chinese market. So there's always the risk that people will circumvent the regulation. But there, at the same time, good people working together can help to influence that. For example, on palm oil, you now see that Unilever and a bunch of other companies that stand for good approaches to palm oil actually control about 20% of the global market, and as a result of that market share, can begin to force their standards on the rest. But it's a delicate balance.
It's tough. Was the project you were talking about with the smallholders, was that involved with the Livelihoods Fund, or is that something different? Because we've covered them on the show.
No, I was working for the private sector at the time for an audit and advisory company, and it was a sort of pro bono project that we did together with WWF to look at beef, soy, and palm oil. And what you could do to use security of supply as a way of improving things rather than supply chain management.
It's interesting to see how far it goes, but then you do get these companies being undermined by other groups that aren't thinking so long term, because it only works if you don't plan to own those shares or have an interest in that company 15 years from now, and you want to extract everything you can right now and then move on to something else a few years down the road.
Well, I live in Holland, in the Netherlands. We have this interesting, rather macabre phenomenon called explosive chickens. And the explosive chickens are chickens that are grown so fast through feeding and hormones that you would think they're about to explode. That's how fast they grow. The problem with these chickens is, because they're produced in this way, they're a fraction or a significant fraction cheaper than chickens that are produced in a nicer way. And what you find is, at least in this country, is very little willingness to pay for something that's better, that's more responsible. So a significant part of the challenge is that, I was once talking to the leader of the Green Party in Holland, who said, Dutch people are just like chameleons. They're really, really green until they walk into the voting booth and close the curtain, and then they all turn dark brown. So, we're great at paying lip service to these issues, but when it comes to making a personal financial sacrifice, it's unfortunately still often a very different story. And part of the larger challenge, I think, that we face is to come to a different definition of value. We're still in a situation where most corporates are valued only in terms of the cash that they return to shareholders, and everything that they do to contribute to natural capital, social capital, intellectual capital is basically outside the valuation of a company. So there is actually no incentive to a company to be a good citizen if it comes to an appreciation by shareholders. So companies don't report on the good that they're doing in society. Investors don't ask for information on the good that's being done in society. And this is why we, at least intellectually, all recognize that a significant percentage of corporate value is actually locked up in intangibles rather than in tangibles. So a lot of capital is locked up in the good that companies have done, the networks that they have, the people that they employ, their contribution to society. But we're extremely poor in expressing that. And part of the challenge, I think, is to come to a more holistic and more modern definition of value.
Yeah, we saw that recently. You mentioned Unilever before, which has consistently been a pretty good actor in this space, and they were vulnerable to a takeover by Kraft simply because the good value that they've created wasn't reflected in their share price. And there was a scary period a little while ago where we all thought, is Unilever going to get gobbled up by Kraft? And if they do, what happens to all these great principles that they've been implementing over the years? Do you see the Sustainable Development Goals as a way of fixing this market failure?
I don't know if it's going to fix it, but I think it can help to fix it. We both referred to Unilever, which I think still has. He's on the way out, but has a CEO called Paul Polman. And immediately after the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted, he created a business commission on sustainable development, which tried to calculate the so-called SDG price, so SDG standing for Sustainable Development Goals. And they zoomed in on 4 sectors of the global economy and said, well, what about if we were to, in relation to these sectors of the economy, if we were to put achieving the Sustainable Development Goals front and center? So what if we were to make it our target to supply more people with primary health care? What if we made it our target to supply babies with nutritious food? What if we made it our target to provide people with access to safe drinking water? What would be the business case around that? And they came to the conclusion that just in relation to these 4 areas, there was a potential business prize in the order of $12 trillion to be made by acting on the Sustainable Development Goals. And that stems from the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, by the end of this century, 1 in every 2 humans is going to be an African. The average age of populations in Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, is under 25. So the real markets of the future are relatively poor people in emerging economies. So, once again, I'm almost sounding like an advertiser for Unilever, but what Unilever has done is, I don't know how you buy your soap powder, or maybe you don't buy soap powder, but you probably buy it in, kilogram packages. But very poor people can't afford a kilogram of soap powder, but they can afford a tiny little bag. So what Unilever has done is just very simply put soap powder into smaller packages and make hygienic soap, which is good from a health perspective, in smaller bars of soap. There's some pretty dumb examples, but I think they go to show that there is a business case for investing in poorer people in society, and there is a business case around working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. A former colleague of mine, actually from that World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the former president, said something which I thought was very smart. And what he said was that business cannot succeed in a society that fails, which I think is true. But the flip side of that, he didn't say that, but the flip side of that is that therefore I think businesses have an opportunity to ensure that societies succeed.
We did an analysis of two Dutch companies, Jumbo and Albert Heijn, both of which have made a lot of pledges on sustainability pledges, virtually identical pledges, virtually identical business model. But then when we went to dive in to see which company was actually keeping their pledges, we found Albert Heijn did everything they said they would, and even brought WWF in to audit what they did, whereas Jumbo didn't do anything. But they were both making the same claims. They were both winning green points with consumers, but only one was actually going ahead and implementing what they said they were doing.
So that sort of takes us nicely back to the gold standard, because one of the reasons why at this climate conference in Poland the issue of markets and market mechanisms was pushed forward was because there's a lot of skepticism around the environmental integrity of markets. Actually, I was having in Poland conversations with people from the European Commission who are very concerned that now the airline industry has accepted climate goals, and emission trading, carbon credits are part of that. That airline companies are buying garbage credits. Credits that come from Ukrainian factories that have closed down anyway. Or what we saw under the climate change regime was people claiming credits for HFCs being destroyed in China, which shouldn't have been produced in the first place, which should have been regulated out.
We're getting into a couple of different things here that I probably should have untangled in real time but didn't. First, the HFCs he's referring to are hydrofluorocarbons, which are powerful greenhouse gases that can trap 10,000 times as much heat as carbon dioxide does. Under the Kyoto Protocol, you could earn carbon offsets by destroying HFCs, but some Chinese companies got caught gaming the system by producing HFCs just to destroy them for offsets. It was pretty sleazy, and these offsets were banned from the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanism, but they've become symbolic of a whole slew of other offsets that were allowed under the Kyoto Protocol, when the science was still evolving and the world was a bit different, as we'll see later in today's show. Offsets that don't meet today's standards aren't recognized today. Yvo mentioned emissions from international air travel. Well, that's something that happens outside of the UNFCCC, under an organization called the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO, which I covered in Episode 8 and will cover again soon. ICAO is going to cap emissions from international flights after 2021, but it will let airlines offset their emissions to stay below the cap. Negotiators inside ICAO, however, are still debating which types of offsets can be used, and some countries want to use offsets that were created in the pilot phase of the Kyoto Protocol, but ended up not really reducing emissions. These are some of those offsets that are not recognized today in the UNFCCC. On top of this, there's the question of how countries will account for offsets generated at home, but transferred either to other countries or into ICAO. I've covered these issues extensively on Ecosystem Marketplace, and I'll try to break it all down into a podcast episode or two soon. But the gist for now is that negotiators at last year's December climate conference pushed a final decision on markets to this year's talks in Santiago, which happens in December 2019. If you want more details now, you can check out my December 15, 2018 Ecosystem Marketplace story, Katowice Climate Deal Leaves Carbon Markets Intact but Incomplete. Or you can keep checking your Bionic Planet feed for the episode that covers them. And if you want that sooner rather than later, give me support by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com. I'm getting very good at weaving these pitches in, and hope I'm not turning you guys off. Before we get back to the interview, a quick warning: we bounce around a bit from here on in, and I do repeat myself, but I decided to leave that in, even though this episode is probably going to be the longest one I've done so far. That's because I thought it might be good to restate some things. There's also a point where a pop-up notification makes its way into the recording. Sorry, I hope you get a little comedic relief from that.
So there's a huge concern that although people see the benefits of market, that all kinds of, maybe jumbo-style garbage is going to come into the market. And one of the things why I joined the gold standard is because they ensure that anything that they certify is gold standard, that it is real.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, this issue of the gold standard started as a standard for emission reductions on carbon, and now they're going to be trying to quantify things like, women's empowerment and things that are a little bit fuzzier. Sounds like quite a challenge. Is that something you would want to go into, or is that something that's more for one of their technical people?
Well, it depends how far you want to go into it, but I think I would say that a goal is only as valuable as your ability to measure its achievement. And incidentally, a lot of them have very weak metrics underneath them. Then I think having a bottom-up process to try and measure that is a very worthwhile endeavor. I was talking to a bunch of people a while ago who were working on this and said, well, let's assume that you put in a 100-kilometer road from A to B in Tanzania. Well, then you know that you've put in place 100 kilometers of road infrastructure. But then you get to a whole bunch of much more interesting questions, at least for me, much more interesting questions, which is the question, since you can travel faster on a tarmac road than on a mud track, how many tomatoes produced by poor farmers are making it to the market healthy instead of rotten? You can ask yourself the question, how many school children are able to get to school because they can take a bus on a road as opposed to having to walk 4 hours to school. You could ask yourself the question, how many pregnant mothers make it to maternity clinics that they wouldn't have reached in time on that mud road? And that's what I think calculating impact against the Sustainable Development Goals is all about, that it's not just about 100 kilometers of tarmac, but about all the associated benefits that flow from that. Probably that's not going to be a precise science by tomorrow, but it's still, I think, very much worth the effort.
Yeah, and it gets to be really, really fascinating. I had a talk with your colleague Sarah Lugers about this, and I think I'll probably follow up and devote a whole show to some of those metrics and how they're evolving. One of the interesting things that we found when looking just at the voluntary market, we did a buyer's analysis, and we wanted to look at companies that were purchasing offsets, companies like Disney and Microsoft, that they were not obligated to purchase offsets, but they went ahead and purchased them anyway. And we wanted to see how they were using them. What we found that was very interesting was that companies that purchased offsets initially did so thinking that they would just reduce their emissions that way, but the unexpected consequence was that the process of purchasing these forced them to put a price on carbon. Then suddenly they had an internal price on greenhouse gas emissions from all operations, and then suddenly the emissions became something they had to become very, very consciously aware of, and then this led to them doing more of the kind of internal emission reductions that need to happen, where they were able to reduce by changing their manufacturing processes or transportation processes or changing the suppliers they purchase from. So there's this issue of how when you push these things out into public awareness, they then become something that can be dealt with. And it sounds like that's what you're kind of talking about here too.
Well, as you described, it's about introducing a new metric. Let's say that you're in a building and you have a boiler, and you were planning to replace the boiler in 3 years' time, and to replace it today would be to throw it out 3 years early, which comes at cost. But you still have to reduce emissions by a certain amount. So then it's probably more attractive for you to buy some emission credits, run the boiler for another 3 years, and then replace it when the time is right. So it allows you to time, I think, economic decisions better. And that internal carbon price, which, as you say, now lots of companies have, it gives you a different metric to use when making choices, when making investment decisions. So that's great. The thing that strikes me as a bit funny is the fact that we seem to think there needs to be a single carbon price, and that multiple carbon prices are a bad thing, which I find strange. In the sense that it's perfectly normal for me to walk into a shop or into a store, depending how you call it, and I can buy a really cheap, nasty watch which will probably break in 2 weeks for €5, or I can spend €200 on a really decent watch. That's perfectly accepted. So why shouldn't we have a carbon price of, I don't know, $100 a ton, which is related to really good stuff, like wind energy or solar energy, and have a different carbon price for different emission reductions, which are maybe less high standard.
Yeah, or that have different co-benefits.
Yeah.
If it's creating a bunch of sustainable jobs, then maybe it's worth more.
Exactly. That goes to that point on a broader definition of value.
Yeah. And again, loops back to the SDGs. I know I've gone over time already, and I don't want to take up your whole day, but I'm wondering if we could just wrap up by doing a quick look back on the Poland climate talks that we went through. What's the biggest success to come out of the talks in Katowice, and what are the biggest failures, and how do we move forward from here?
Well, so in Paris, they made a political commitment to all address climate change, but they didn't agree exactly how they were going to do it, and they didn't agree the rules on how they would report on action and monitor action. So what this conference did, and it's a bit boring, but it's very important, is it agreed the rule book. It agreed how action on climate change is going to be reported and measured. That was the ambition for this conference. It achieved that, apart from pushing some topics like markets a bit into the future. But it did what it was supposed to do. I've seen a lot of complaints in the media that it didn't show enough ambition, but I don't think this conference was about ambition. I think you should focus on taking the second step after you've taken the first, not before. So I'm happy with it having agreed the rules on how to move forward. I think a big advantage in that context is the fact that there is one set of rules for everyone, but that countries are given time to put in place the institutions and the mechanisms to fully implement the rules, that they deserve help to do that. So we've moved away from that distinction in the climate regime that you're either industrialized or you're poor, and if you're poor, you're never going to be industrialized. So different standards for different groups of countries, that has been moved away from in the direction of a more gradual scale of all moving towards the same standards. So I would say that's all good.
I find it frustrating, or the critique that a lot of reporters make when they talk about the lack of ambition, because the Paris Agreement creates a framework within which ambition can be achieved and measured and verified and everything else, and that ambition has to come from us. It has to come from individual countries, and that requires people within those countries understanding what's at stake. And then it comes back to media. It comes back to our newspapers and our television stations really ramping up their focus on this so that people really do understand what has to happen to get out of this mess. And then you can get people putting pressure on their politicians to go ahead and push for the increased ambition. I always feel like my tribe of journalists, we always parachute into these things in the last few days and wonder why there's no ambition, and never look in the mirror and say that's our job.
Yeah.
There's a media failure here that I think we need to address somehow.
Yes, I mean I think there's a media failure in this unnecessarily and unfairly having been portrayed as a failure when it's actually achieved what it was supposed to achieve. At the same time, I think it's a responsibility of journalists to hold people's feet to the fire and to say, well, you may be really happy that you agreed your little rule book, but we're now going to be watching you on how you actually use it and implement.
Yeah.
The rule book he's referring to is the set of rules for implementing the Paris Agreement, and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the part dealing with markets. Also, you heard what he said about journalists and journalism. If you think he and I nailed it, and if you think I'm part of the solution, then join me by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com or patreon.com/bionicplanet, or at the very least by switching to the Radio Public app, which gives me a few pennies for everyone who listens through to the end.
My understanding of the impasse was this Article 6, in which it was broken into several different paragraphs, and the two key ones for markets are Article 6.2, which was about the structure of bilateral trading clusters. They're calling them carbon clubs, where multiple countries can trade among themselves. And then you had 6.4, which was the creation of a global carbon market operating under the UNFCCC along the lines of the CDM. And my understanding on the impasse in both of those was in 6.2 said that these countries could develop these markets in accordance with existing guidance and move forward that way, but that some countries, and my understanding is Costa Rica was the primary country pushing for this, that wanted to add in more safeguards, essentially bringing up old issues that we dealt with in the past, and everyone thought we've moved beyond that. Not enough safeguards is obviously no good, but too many makes it unworkable. So that was the fear of 6.2, and then 6.4, you had Brazil pushing for the right to double count their emissions. They basically were saying, we want to have the right to sell an emission reduction to another country, and we still get to account for that in our own emission reductions, and then we'll make good on it at some point in the future. And they also had these old CDM offsets that they'd created back in the day, and they wanted to kind of get rid of them so that environmental integrity would go out the window. So that, in my perception, is that was the key impasse on this. I know that Brazil one has been there from day one, and the Costa Ricans, they seem to be operating in good faith, but still pushing for too much, something that would be almost burdensome. I guess what I'm wondering is if, from your perspective, am I accurately summarizing the issue, and how do you think we can move forward? How do you think we can move beyond this to reach some kind of agreement on markets before the next COP?
Well, I mean, this regime becomes operational in 2020, so we've got a bit more time. Although it is good to give people early clarity, I suppose it's the perpetual struggle of getting it 100% right, but making it 100% workable, or making it 100% flexible and 100% useless. I mean, on the one hand, there's a danger in over-designing it, putting in place so many rules that nobody's going to want to use the instrument because it's just too expensive and too complicated. But you also want to avoid a lot of garbage coming into the system. And I'd say on the second point, to the old credits, those date back to a previous international treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, which only talked about targets for a limited number of industrialized countries. And now we're talking about a new treaty and a new arrangement with a different set of rules. And basically people are questioning is why should you be allowed to take a whole bunch of stuff from the old agreement into the new? Let's make a fresh start. I mean, under the old regime, rich countries had to reduce emissions, poor countries didn't. The atmosphere doesn't give a damn where you reduce a ton as long as you reduce it. So under the old regime, if Germany or Holland or whoever paid to have a ton of emissions reduced in Brazil, then the atmosphere would say, fine by me, here's a ton avoided, don't care who did it, who paid for it, the ton is gone. But under the new regime, where both Germany in this example and Brazil have an obligation to reduce by a certain amount, you want to avoid the same ton being counted twice. You don't want Brazil saying we avoided that ton, Germany saying we avoided that ton, creating the impression that two have been reduced, whereas in fact it's only one.
Yeah. Going from that sticking point to the other end, what would you say is the greatest breakthrough to come out of Katowice, or maybe the biggest surprise?
We've had this other thing that I just referred to in the climate process of industrialized countries on the left side of the fence and developing countries on the right side of the fence, and ne'er the two shall meet. So this all dates back to the 1992 Climate Convention, when some countries that were really rich in 1992 and therefore classified as industrialized are now really, really poor. And you have some countries that were really, really poor in 1992, or relatively poor in 1992, and are really rich today, places like Singapore and Korea and maybe Brazil and China as well. But those countries still sit at the 1992 side of the fence. Brazil, China, India, South Africa, Singapore, Korea are still claiming that they're developing countries, whereas in fact they're not. And in the middle of this conference in Poland, China made a 180-degree turn and said, we think the same rules should apply to everyone. I would not have predicted that. Great, it happened.
So we shouldn't be too worried about this double counting thing.
Yeah, plus countries like Brazil, if they don't find common ground and compromise, they will end up with nothing. And if they end up with nothing, then Costa Rica will end up with 100% integrity because nothing will happen.
Yeah, my country's in the same boat or a similar one. Anyway, I know we're up against it here. Any final thoughts we can wrap up with?
An important issue for me is how close we are to the edge and how dramatic change can be once you reach that edge. And that sounds terribly dramatic, but I don't think anyone or almost nobody predicted the internal combustion engine. But once it was there, it dramatically changed transportation. Or almost nobody predicted the mobile phone. But once it was there, it made an awful lot of copper wire completely unnecessary. And I think in a number of areas that relate to climate, we're incredibly close to that tipping point. The cost of wind and solar has come down by 70% in the past 5 years. In many, many parts of the world, wind and solar are commercially viable. There's still an investment challenge there, but they're commercially viable. And when they become commercially viable, then, the whole debate over renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy becomes sort of irrelevant. We've made huge advances in electric vehicle technology. We're making progress in battery storage technology. So while the politicians are huddling in huge, dingy conference centers, technology is moving on. That doesn't mean that we can all sit back and it's going to happen all by itself, but we need to be focusing on that, in many instances, that little extra push that the technologies of the future need in order to get the technologies of the past out of the way.
That's Yvo de Boer closing out this edition of Bionic Planet. Until next time, this is Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.